It was Hollywood, the land of dreams and money, of movie stars and oil barons, and wild and giddy excess. This was a world Henry Ford detested. The feeling was mutual. Most Hollywood stars wouldn't be caught dead in a Model T.
The combination of great imagination and new excitement bred a group of people, wealthy people, who were recently wealthy in fact, who really wanted style. They wanted something special. And an ordinary car in the 20s was kind of boxy. At that time, it was fun to display your wealth. Women wore their jewelry, they enjoyed their costumes, and men dressed up just as well, and they loved their fast cars. The whole thing had tremendous drama, and everybody loved it.
Starting in 1911, rich Californians who hankered for cars that were outrageous and colorful turned to a small coach builder on South Main Street, the Earl Automobile Works. Harley Earl and his father had a prosperous business, building custom cars and movie props like the chariots used in Ben-Hur. Family friends included actor Al Jolson and film director Cecil B. DeMille.
Harley Earl's early experience was influenced by the dramas of the movie business. He himself became an absolute fashion plate. He had an excellent tailor. He was a tall man, towering, 6'5.5", a walking wardrobe. He had style. Wonderful white linen suit, a purple shirt and an orange tie, and green suede shoes. Now this knocked him dead. He always had a tremendous tan.
By his late 20s, Harley Earl had made a name for himself with his sensational designs.
Harley Earl, from the very beginning, had an unbelievably simple philosophy, because cars were so awkward and so high and so out of balance, and center of gravity was so bad. Harley Earl spent his life making cars lower, wider, and longer. Harley Earl put the flair in cars.
People in show business were really fascinated by touches of style, emphatic style. If they saw something that came out of Earl's imagination with these patent leather fenders, they'd stop and stare. They were really fascinated by the novelties.
Earl catered to his clients' every whim. Nothing was too outrageous. An Earl custom-built car would cost $28,000. And he had more work than he could handle.
A major hero at the time was Fatty Arbuckle. He was a comedian, big fellow, and so what Earl was able to do was design a car that had a tremendously large chassis. It was a big car, and so when Mr. Arbuckle got into it, he looked normal. So the sense of scale was appropriate for the style of car. He built, I think, 2 or 3 cars for him, and they still exist. They're prized items.
Styling details that Earl popularized would be imitated for years to come, like the Landau roof and a rakish slanted windshield.
If you make the lady in the back seat something special, you could give her a cameo window, which he did. This is an oval-shaped window behind the rear door window. And many pictures survive that show whoever the lady was looking out of the window, beautifully framed with this oval shape. It's a very smart idea.
While Hollywood was on the cutting edge of automotive fashion, the cars most Americans drove tended to be homely affairs with little style.
The 20s were really an ungainly time when you went from the old brass cars, which were really quite beautiful, into these homely cars of the 20s that were starting to be enclosed and all that, and they were just kind of pedestrian vehicles. They were practical, getting better all the time, but they had no flair.
Years before, Henry Ford had touched off a revolution with a car that every man could afford. Now, the new president of General Motors would touch off the next. Alfred Sloan, a marketing genius, set out to mass-produce automobiles as beautiful as the custom cars of Hollywood.
He knew the public's appetite. He recognized that fundamental feature that they like something new. We all do. if you offer a new play, a new piece of music, anything that you can think of that's artful, and if it's a new statement, it's an excitement.
General Motors, it's hard to imagine now, but they were hungry at the time, trying to make those cars better and offer more than Ford did.
Alfred Sloan had a hunch that people would pay that little bit extra for style and pizzazz. And Harley Earl was hired to design a smaller, less expensive version of the Cadillac. The 1927 LaSalle, the first mass-produced car designed by a stylist, was an instant success.
Alfred Sloan was trying to appeal to all types of clientele, and he had the ladies in mind as well as the men, and he visualized a long, long time ago that the women's market was going to be 50% of the market. By God, he's right. I think it's 52 now.
Advertisers were realizing more and more that women were the buyers of a great number of products and that they needed to pitch them towards women. They stereotyped women as being particularly style conscious.
In 1927, Sloan put Harley Earl in charge of a new department, the Art and Color section, the first of its kind in Detroit. It was the beginning of a corporate career that would make Earl one of the most powerful men in the industry.
Harley Earl really started the first sizable styling department. Before that, all the styling was done up at the factory by the engineers that were putting the car together, who may have been terrific engineers, but they frankly didn't know a car from a canoe when it came to styling.
For the next 4 decades, Earl's department would be responsible for the design of 50 million cars.
He knew that he was designing for the common man and the middle class. So he gave them cars that made every trip an excitement. It didn't make a difference whether you had a shabby house, you didn't have much money, but if you could jump into the car and be somebody, you arrived in this exciting automobile, he gave them that opportunity, and it didn't cost them an awful lot. It's a lot cheaper to buy a car than it is a house. So he gave them imagery, wonderful, exciting imagery.
Earl began to challenge the most basic assumptions about mass-producing automobiles. First, the matter of color.
Advertisers had discovered by the early 1920s the color could make people feel better about the products that they owned. There was a great move towards emphasizing the bringing of color to the kitchen. The same thing for bathrooms. Bathrooms modeled on the great luxurious scenes in movies. If there were going to be colors within your house, why not colors that would individualize your automobile also?
General Motors began to offer cars in rich, vibrant colors.
One year, they came out with a beautiful catalog that was just called Nature's Studies, and it was just beautiful colors in automobiles.
Spurred by his top management, Henry Ford gave the Model T a minor facelift. Larger fenders, nickel-plated radiators, even a little color.
And so we had the spectacle of the Model T, like a prim spinster wearing a nice new hat, going off to the market, and none too successfully, but still looking more colorful than it had in the past. But the guts of the car was practically the same. Henry Ford simply could not sniff the winds of change.
In spite of pressure from his son Edsel and from Ford dealers across the country, the old man stubbornly held on to the idea that price alone would sell cars.
General Motors positioned Chevrolet slightly above Ford with the idea of suggesting to people who had already had the opportunity to own a Model T that they could now move up a notch, that a Chevrolet was a slightly different class position.
And while the Chevrolet and the other cars may cost a couple $100 more than the Model T, many people thought that they were worth it.
The pecking order for buying these cars was important. When you had a Chevrolet, if you got a Pontiac, it better look more expensive and this and have this feature and that feature. And, or if you really wanted an Oldsmobile, you had to go up from the cost of that nice Pontiac, and that Oldsmobile better offer some new things.
It didn't matter so much who you were or where you came from. You could now improve your position by trading up. General Motors offered a car for every rung on the social ladder, and a brand new model every year.
So you own a car for maybe a couple of years, and it's not worn out by any means, but somehow that new Buick really looks good to you if it's well designed. So you trade it in. A car might be built forever, and some of those old cars are still running, but the idea of marketing them on the strength of newness and excitement and style, nothing wrong with that.
For the first time, Americans were going into debt for something other than a house. 75% of the cars sold in the mid-1920s were bought on the installment plan. Ford was being trounced by glamour, comfort, and easy credit.
Henry Ford finally saw the handwriting on the wall. Model T sales were flagging in 1926 and into 1927, and not even he could ignore that fact as much as he was dedicated to the idea that the Model T was just what the American public wanted.
On the afternoon of May 26, 1927, the 15 millionth Model T rolled off the assembly line. Ford announced it would be the last.
When the news went out, there were many Model T owners who were dismayed that the last Model T had been produced. A man in Montclair, New Jersey, promptly bought 8 Model Ts so that he would presumably have one for the remainder of his life. A woman in Toledo, Ohio, bought 6 for the same reason.
A stunned America waited to see what Henry Ford would do next. In the 1920s, while many Americans were going into debt to buy mass-produced cars, the ultra-rich were acquiring some of the most elegant automobiles ever made.
The Duesenbergs, always a spectacle.
The great cars of the classic era.
$300,000, 320. I am selling, fair warning, at $330,000.
It was an absolutely glorious age. I mean, if you go to any old car show now and you look at any of the cars of the 20s or 30s, I mean, these are sculptures. These are things of beauty. These are pieces of art.
Nobody could afford them. They were made in small numbers. Today, a Lincoln or a Cadillac, they're everywhere. There's almost as many of those as there are Chevys, too. But boy, that wasn't the case in those days. When you saw a Packard 12 or a Cadillac 16 or a Duesenberg, you never forgot it. Everybody just was in awe of those things.
Augie and Fred Duesenberg had a tremendous reputation for building the best racing cars in the market, and they'd won some significant races. They built the first American car to win a French Grand Prix.
The Duesenberg brothers built 3 cars that won the Indy 500, and then went on to produce a passenger car, the Duesenberg Model A. The first Duesenbergs weren't very pretty, but they were powerful.
Straight 8 engine, single overhead camshaft, a very modern design. This is a car that'll run down the road at 65 miles an hour, which doesn't sound a whole lot today, but if you consider that's a 1927 automobile, this was a very, very fast car.
But the superlative cars, the classic Duesenbergs, those dazzling cars that today cost well over $1 million, were created in partnership with an entrepreneur, a Midwesterner with a spectacular sense of style, E.L. Cord. It was the marriage of Duesenberg chassis and engines with individually styled and handmade bodies that produced some of the most powerful and beautiful automobiles in the world. The Duesenberg Model J.
It was a glamorous car that appealed a lot to movie stars and to people of ambition.
With a price tag starting at $17,000, the Model J was built to outclass, outrun, and outlast any car on the road.
Duesenbergs were bought mainly by the very flamboyant, as flamboyant as the car was itself. There were very few dowagers who owned Duesenbergs.
Gary Cooper owned a Model J. In fact, he owned 2. So did Greta Garbo and the King of Spain. Clark Gable courted Carole Lombard in this car at 130 miles an hour.
It was just awesome. It was so powerful compared to the other ones. When they were busy talking about 100 or 160 horsepower, the Duesenberg had 265 horsepower, the standard model. And then they supercharged it as if that wasn't enough, and it pulled 320 horsepower. Those cars would do 100 miles an hour in second gear.
And of course, then everybody said, well, what'll it do in height? Nobody knows. Gosh, there isn't a road big enough for it.
So the expression, it's a doozy, was set in the way those cars were perceived by people. It's a doozy.
It was the Jazz Age.
Mores were changing, women bobbed their hair, you saw the rise of the flapper, men looking like lounge lizards, everybody smoking cigarettes. And with this change in values, the automobile provided just the right vehicle.
We were becoming a true consumer society. People bought not only out of necessity, but for the sheer pleasure of buying. Consumers could now choose among 72 different model cars, produced by General Motors. The most expensive, the most elegant, was the Cadillac.
Automobiles in those days, certainly much more so than today, gathered their own following. I mean, if you were a Packard man, you were a Packard man until the day you died, and beyond, most likely.
The Packard brothers sold cars for the discriminating. Their ads spoke of conquest and leadership.
Packard did a series about how many senators owned Packards, how many governors and how many ambassadors who took their Packards over with them to wherever they went. And a Packard was considered the car that said you were wealthy, but didn't say it quite as loudly as a Duesenberg did.
Very, very interesting cars were being born in the late 20s and early 30s. But most people didn't even see one. If you're lucky enough to live in New York or Chicago or Hollywood, you saw them, but most people never even saw them. They saw pictures of them.
Out in Detroit in 1927, Henry Ford, who had said he didn't give a damn about style, was forced to admit that the rest of the country did. In July, he told a reporter, 64 years today, and the biggest job of my life lies ahead. For months, all Ford plants in the U.S. had been shut, while Ford worked in secret to come up with a new car.
When he abandoned the Model T, he did not have a successor car in place. The fact that Ford discontinued that car without a replacement vehicle must be classed as one of the great business blunders in automotive history.
That was a really disaster. And what it did is it started somebody else, Chevrolet, finally passed Ford as the largest selling car, something that nobody thought would ever happen.
Ford dealers were going bankrupt, others defecting to GM. Rumors about Henry's new model surfaced in the press. Retooling was costing $1 million a day. Ford refused to comment. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall.
And there was tremendous speculation throughout the length and the breadth of the land. And Henry Ford, rather than announce any plans that he might have, decided to let the press and the public speculate. I don't think that any product ever produced before or since the Model A has had so much free publicity.
Ford kept his plans secret, refused to unveil the car. There was an immense buildup of public anticipation waiting for the moment in which it would finally be revealed.
On December 2nd, 1927, just outside the Ford plant, the Model A was finally introduced. That day in New York City, 250,000 people turned out to get a glimpse of the car that they had all been waiting for. Crowds blocked traffic throughout the metropolitan area. There were reports that in Detroit, 31,000 people were storming the convention hall. In small towns all over America, Ford representatives drove down Main Street to show off the car. Russell Poole remembers their arrival.
All summer long, people were waiting to see what the Model A was like, and they didn't come out till late that fall. I remember people going to the showroom to see that first Model A. It was quite exciting.
Within 2 weeks, almost 500,000 cars had been sold. By January, production couldn't keep up with demand. The Model A came in different styles and fabulous colors, with lacquer finish and fancy upholstery. In a reversal of strategy, Ford pitched the Model A to a swankier clientele.
In some ads, there would even be chauffeurs and maids in the picture to suggest Model A was perfectly suitable for those of high social stature.
Ford had done it again. He had produced a universally beloved car. Even today, many collectors believe that the Model A was the best car ever built. Lauren Laudy is a fan.
That was the car that I fell in love with. When I got older, like the age I am now, I bought a 1930 Model A, which I happen to have in my garage. Completely restored, just like a brand new car. My dad would let me shift. He would work the pedals, but I was working the shift. He would put in the clutch, and I would put it up to second. He would put in the clutch, and I would put it down to neutral. He would put in the clutch, I'd put it down to third. You know, it was like a ballet between the two of us. And it was a lot of fun. It brings back a lot of memories.
The Model A had scarce settled into the American landscape when the stock market crashed. In these troubled times, holding on to the car you owned became a national obsession. And the roads across America would become an endless source of cheap entertainment. By the 1930s, the American road, once an empty landscape, had been transformed into a giant theme park. Surreal images were capturing our attention at 45 miles an hour. We were on the move, and driving had become one of the great entertainments of all time.
People would give up their food almost rather than give up their cars. Gas was cheap, and better roads were being built. It wasn't long before the people who owned land along those roads began to see gold floating along the highway.
There were commercial opportunities no one had ever dreamed of. In a country where 1/3 of all homes were without indoor plumbing, certified restrooms became a major attraction.
Nurses would go from gas station to gas station and would be there to ensure the cleanliness of the place. It would bring people in if you had advertised restrooms, and people would stop and be bound to buy gasoline while they were there.
For the hungry, mom-and-pop restaurants turned up everywhere. Every meal an adventure. Hot chili, foot-long dogs, chicken fried steak. Those who hated surprises found comfort under an orange roof.
Howard Johnson combined the little hot dog stand with the ice cream parlor with the full-service restaurant. If you saw that familiar sign, you know that if you found one in Boston or you found one on Long Island, you'd get the same good food. It was predictable.
Some were so attached to their cars they never wanted to get out of them.
Merchants put 2 and 2 together and began to see that not only could you drive in the car, but you could eat in the car. It wasn't very long before that famous person called a car hop would come when you tooted your horn, take your order, and bring out the food and serve it right in the car.
There were other places like that all up and down the highway system, providing food for people who were in a hurry. And a little later, a couple of brothers by the name of McDonald opened their own place out in San Bernardino, California. The rest, as they say, is history.
At the height of the Depression, millions of Americans hit the road, not for fun, but in a desperate search for work. The film, The Grapes of Wrath, told their story.
In the Soviet Union, the communist authorities imported this movie, and they withdrew it from the theaters within a few weeks because the audience was more impressed by the fact that even wandering peasants seemed to own an automobile or a vehicle of their own than the fact that they didn't seem to have very much.
As we took to wandering farther and farther, the road was marked by tourist cottages, some more fanciful than others. Joy Fischel's parents and grandparents built one of the early tourist courts when she was a little girl.
They named the camp Camp Joy. As far as I know, just because it had a happy sound to it and was a pleasant place.
Camp Joy was a family-run motel where everyone had to work.
When I was 12, the folks set me up in business for myself. From their trips to Florida, my grandfather in the winter would ship a barrel, say, of selected shells back. And they were snapped up because back then seashells were quite a novelty.
The first motels were informal, homey places, often extensions of somebody's house. Over time, they became more businesslike. Then in the 30s, they began to install inner spring mattresses, radios, hot showers. More creature comforts than many people had back home. Camp Joy introduced the ultimate convenience, a drive-in motel room.
There were big wooden sliding doors that literally opened up one whole wall so that you could open the car door, step right into your room. And people really appreciated this.
The Fischels catered to a family business. Other motels had quite a different reputation. Some were known as ideal love nests for the hot pillow trade. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called motels camps of crime, hideouts for hardened criminals, prostitutes, and white slavers.
Gangsters, everyday robbers, anybody that was interested in a life of doing no good saw the benefits of doing it by car.
In the 1930s, high on the 10 most wanted list were bank robbers Pretty Boy Floyd and the team of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. One night in Lebanon, Missouri, they were all holed up at Camp Joy.
They stayed in one of the drive-ins so they couldn't be identified from the street. Their behavior while they were there was a little strange because only one of them at a time would come out, walk up the road somewhere, get something to eat, and bring back food to the unit and go in. That'd be the last you'd see of them. The local sheriff heard that they were in this area, but they had already moved on.
Every criminal, it seemed, had a car of choice. For Clyde Barrow, it was the Ford V8. He loved this car for its quick acceleration. In a letter to Henry Ford, Barrow wrote, "While I still have breath in my lungs, the V8 is a dandy car." Clyde Champion Barrow would go to his death in his beloved Ford V8.
Hudson, at that time, was building a car called the Terraplane, which John Dillinger favored. He wrote a letter to Hudson saying, "Whenever I can steal one, I do."
In the mid-1930s, car owners became obsessed with speed. Cars could now go over 85 miles an hour, and the auto industry was moving into a revolutionary era.
The automobile went from this wonderful, old, elegant, classic thing overnight to streamlining. It was truly a new era, and America couldn't wait. You couldn't bring it to America fast enough.
In all the great design shops, artists were sculpting cars of the future. Streamlining. It was a marriage between art and aerodynamics. The first streamlined production car, the Chrysler Airflow.
The car was truly aerodynamic. It had been tested in the wind tunnel. The Chrysler Airflow was a masterpiece of engineering. The structure of the car was part of the body, not a frame, which was very safe and very lightweight. The passengers were moved forward, so they sat between the wheels and had a wonderful ride compared to anything they had ever had before.
Chrysler promoted the car's construction, its toughness and reliability.
Here it comes on its death drop, leaping clear of the ledge. You'd expect it to be crushed like an eggshell, and a lesser car would.
The Airflow was clearly an extraordinary car.
The car that can live through such a grueling ordeal is the car you can trust.
But for all its toughness, most people thought the Airflow just plain ugly. Only 30,000 were ever sold. But the move towards the modern was not to be stopped. Cars, trains, planes, buildings appeared, all with futuristic lines.
Streamlining. Suddenly this became a household word, and what it really amounted to was a cleaning up of design, of bringing all of the disparate, different elements together as a unity.
In the winter of 1935, a car was introduced that would later be described as rolling sculpture. E.L. Cord, who financed the Duesenberg's fabulous Model J just a few years before, introduced the 810 Cord. It would make automotive history. One critic said it looked as if it had been born and raised on the highway.
There was more innovation in that car than any car that ever came out. It was totally new, totally different, and everything else after that paled. It influenced design of many, many cars. And what I loved about that car, it was so simple. Simple and beautiful and low and understated, but it was just new and fresh.
The wonderful thing about those days was that you could differentiate a car from 2 blocks away. You could tell by the radiator configuration, any number of things, because the cars had their own special individual look. There was not a cookie-cutter look to cars in those days.
In 1937, General Motors' styling department was at work on a small and very sophisticated experimental car under the direction of chief designer Harley Earl. 10 years before, Earl's first car for GM was the revolutionary 1927 LaSalle. Now, once again, Earl was ahead of his time.
It was a low, incredibly low speedster, a full foot lower than most cars were at the time. Everybody kept calling it around work the Y job. Y at that time was like X is for experimental airplanes now. Y meant experimental.
The Y job wasn't for sale. It was Earl's vision of the future. It had electric windows and a power-operated convertible roof and retracting headlights. Earl had done away with the old running board. The car had become a symbol of the future. In that moment, between the Depression and the war, Americans in love with the bright promise of technology flooded to the 1939 New York World's Fair.
A city of the future just sprung up in the swamps of New York City. And people came from, all over the country and all over the world from the weary years of the Depression to take a look at what things could be.
50 million visitors gawked at the world of tomorrow.
Electro, the Westinghouse Moto Man.
Quiet, I'm talking. Toots?
One of the most exciting of the exhibits was General Motors' Cities of the Future.
To help us get a glimpse into the future of this unfinished world of ours.
Cars were everywhere and superhighways, and the car was really important. It was the center of the city, and in many ways that image was a portender of what we began to see after World War II. A lot of it came true at a scale that no one would ever have realized then.
This was the fantasy world of 1939, the imaginary world, that 2 years later would have to be postponed, as America went to war. On February 2nd, 1942, automobile production ground to a halt. The last civilian automobile, a Ford, rolled off the assembly line. We were at war, outnumbered, outgunned, and outweighed, in ships, tanks, and planes. The Allies now looked to the industrial might of America, and America looked to Detroit.
The arsenal of democracy. It was centered right here in Detroit. We made the tanks and the guns and the airplanes for the whole world. Everybody was a hardworking, loyal citizen. There was no time for any bantering. It was just work hard.
Americans mobilized and clocks were moved ahead to wartime. As men went overseas, women traded their aprons for overalls and joined the workforce. Folks at home collected scrap metal to make weapons of war. Gas was rationed. Rubber was in short supply. Many Americans took their cars off the road and put them away for the duration.
A lot of dreams had to be deferred. During the war, we had to cut back. Speed limits were reduced to 35 miles an hour. Automobiles went out of production. Suddenly, meat was rationed. Ladies couldn't get nylon stockings, so they started using eyeliner to paint little seams along the backs of their legs. There was a sense of sacrifice.
But sacrifice alone would not be enough. America had to gear up.
The United States Army had to convert this vast automobile productive capacity to military use to create the first military force in the history of the world to be entirely run by the internal combustion engine.
American factories have achieved the impossible. American mass production is delivering the goods. Going first to the great automobile assembly lines, capable of turning out 4 million trucks and passenger cars a year, United States engineers harnessed the skill, mobilized the resources of the most efficient manufacturing system in the world. Where automobile fenders once were made, motors and replacements for thousands upon thousands of planes a year.
There's no question, we knew how to get volume. We built tanks, Chrysler, the tank builder. Nobody ever asked the fuel economy of a tank. They just said, build it. We just want it to last and go kill people, you know, hell of a way, but that's what war's about.
Chevrolet produced nearly 500,000 military trucks and built engines for the C-82 flying boxcar. Cadillac made engines for the M5 tank and parts for the Airacobra fighter. Buick built the Hellcat tank destroyer. Studebaker engines for the Flying Fortress. Henry Ford bragged he could mass-produce whole bombers the same way he mass-produced cars. Aviation experts said it couldn't be done.
Henry Ford, after a great deal of difficulty, proved them wrong and did finally produce almost a bomber per hour, 21 per day. It was a glamour product, and Ford achieved a good deal of recognition because of it.
Even Adolf Hitler said he knew where Detroit was. When you can be doing a bomber an hour out of Willow Run, a bomber an hour, you had mass production really down to scientific points. We just blew them away. Firepower, sheer firepower out of Detroit, the arsenal of democracy.
Out of all this firepower emerged a mighty warrior, little more than 3 feet tall, loaded with personality. The steel soldier Americans would never forget.
Can this be an automobile, men wondered? Looks more like a four-wheel Beetle, one of them said. No, I wasn't too proud of myself back there at the start when the Army first looked me over. Then they sent me out on the road. They tried to drown my motor, but my ignition was set too high for that. They tried to break my back on roller coaster roads. But when I held together, it looked as if the Army and I might somehow get along because they gave me a nickname.
They called it Blitzbuggy, Beetlebug, Leaping Lena, Puddle Jumper. But the only name that really stuck was Jeep. The answer to the Army's need for a general-purpose vehicle. One that could double as a general's limousine or a GI's mule.
There were bids put out by the Army. The design war had to be quick, was between Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company. And Willys won the design, but then they realized they were so versatile that they needed like 500,000 of them, and little Jeep couldn't build them, so the production contract, the big one, went to Ford.
Mass production. It meant only one thing. I was a success. I was getting turned out 1 every 2 minutes. 30 Jeeps an hour. What do you think of that? And I traveled with the guy I like best, my pal, the soldier. Wherever he goes, I go.
In 1942, it was the Egyptian desert. Equipped with machine guns, Jeeps were sent into combat. Moving through hot sand at 60 miles an hour, they formed a flying wedge and blew up a convoy of German supply trucks. Where the Jeep went, wrote one observer, victory was sure to follow. By D-Day 1944, the Jeep was everywhere. Walter Munger remembers the assault on the beaches of Normandy.
I landed on the beach in a Jeep, and this was D+3. And from that moment on, we used to put the Jeep in 4-wheel drive and leave it there because we were never on the main roads. We were always off in dirt roads or fields. It was really a lifesaver, especially in the infantry, because you needed a vehicle that was dependable enough to go anywhere, and I mean anywhere. Off the road, on the road, gullies, through water. You could get stuck with the Jeep. It'd be very hard to do. But all you had to do was take 5 or 6 men, they'd have little handles on it, they lift it up physically, and just put it back on the road.
They laid smoke for advancing tanks, scouted the enemy, evacuated the wounded, and brought essential supplies to the battlefield.
And it was a terrific vehicle for being near the front lines, because I swear you could talk to it and it would hush up. You couldn't hear the motor, you couldn't hear a squeak. You just couldn't beat them.
It was sort of de rigueur to have a Jeep if you were any kind of an officer. Every time you saw a war picture, there was Patton with his guns in his holsters. He was always in a Jeep.
General George S. Patton even customized his Jeep with a red leather seat and a pair of air horns on the hood. Everyone from presidents to movie stars wanted to catch a ride in this rough and ready little car. And when it wasn't chauffeuring celebrities, it plowed snow, brought good cheer, and provided comfort for the body and soul. It could even pull a 52-ton supply train at 22 miles an hour. The Jeep was the best buddy a GI ever had. Cartoons in the Army newspaper, Stars and Stripes, captured this love affair. The artist was Bill Malden. Walter Munger was one of his fans.
He was a GI's favorite. And of course, he used to knock the officers, but even they got a kick out of him because what he put in a picture was worth 1,000 words. I don't know if you remember Joe and Willie. They were his 2 characters, 2 infantrymen. And the conversations that used to go on between them, it was terrific. He just really had a hands-on view of the whole thing.
The first Jeep I'd ever seen was driven by the master sergeant, a battalion sergeant major. And he was very unhappy with it because it wasn't a horse. And I was fascinated by the four-wheel drive and everything about it. And I asked him at one point if a front axle broke or a wheel broke. Do you shoot it? And he thought that was very funny. I drew a cartoon of it, and ever since then I've been eating out on that cartoon. It's the American Rolls Royce. It doesn't ride like one. It certainly doesn't sound like one. But it runs forever, too.
For Americans, this square-shouldered, go-anywhere, do-anything little car became more than a piece of military hardware. It became a treasured symbol of the American spirit that won the war.
The Museum of Modern Art had a display of the most beautiful cars in the world. And one of those vehicles sitting alongside the Accord and the Lincoln Continental and the Rolls-Royce and the Tall Bulago from France was a Jeep.
At war's end, America's love affair with the car was about to accelerate into a romance, so wild, so kinky, so outrageous, it would take the rest of the century to recover. The Finn, the fabulous 50s, and Rebels Without a Cause were just around the corner.